Can you explain to this engineer what critical race theory is? Is it a term that's definable? Is there a tradition? Is there a history? What is good about it? What is bad about it?
It is a tradition. It is a history. It's a school of thought. It started in the law roughly in the 1970s in some of the American Academy. It spilled out. It always aimed to be an activist philosophy. People deny that now, but as I cite in The War in the West, I mean, the foundational texts say as much. This is an activist academic study. We're not just looking at the law. We seek to change the law. And it's built out into all of the other disciplines. I think there's a reason for that, by the way, which is it happened at the time that the humanities and others in America were increasingly weak and didn't know what to do, and they needed more games to play or new games to play.
The psychologists got bored.
Yeah, I mean they needed tenure and they needed something to do. And I mean, it's not an original observation. Plenty of people have made this, but I mean, Neil Ferguson said this some time ago, for instance, that in the last 50 years in American academia, certainly in humanities departments, when somebody dies out who's a great scholar in something, they're just not replaced by somebody of equal stature. They're replaced by somebody who does theory or critical race theory. They're replaced by somebody who does the modern games. Somebody dies out who's a great historian of, say, I don't know, it's the one that's on my mind, Russian history or Russian literature, and they're not replaced by a similar scholar.
In his observation and in yours, is this a recent development?
It's happened in the last few decades for sure, and it's sped up.
Is it because we've gotten to the bottom of some of the biggest questions of history?
No, it's because we're willing to forget the big questions.
Because it's more fun. Big questions aren't as fun.
No, partly it's no. I should stress that partly this is in the weeds, but partly it's a result of the hyperspecialization in academia.
Sure.
If you said you'd like to write your dissertation on Hobbes, if you wanted to, if you something central to Kant's thought or Hegel or something, I mean, that's not popular. That what's popular is to take somebody way down the line from that, because there's a feeling that that's all been done. Mm. So you take something way, way, way down the line from that that's much less important, and then you sort of play with that. And I think most people, anyone who's watching who's been in a philosophy department or anything else in recent years will know that tendency. By the way, there's a very practical consequence of this. I saw this at the end of my friend Roger Scruton's life, when he would occasionally, he didn't get tenure at universities, but he would occasionally be flown in, even by his enemies, to teach courses in various universities in basics of philosophy, because there was no one in the department able to do it. Like he would go in and teach for a semester, Hegel and Kant and Schopenhauer and others, because there was no one to do it, because they were all playing with the things way, way, way down the road from this. Yeah. So that had already happened, and people were searching for new games to play, and the critical race theory stuff forced its way in, partly in the way that all of this that's now known as anti-racism does, which is in a sort of bullying tone of saying, if you don't follow this, it's the same way that all the things that are called studies, I think everything called studies in the humanities should be shut down.
Because of the activist
it's an element. They're all activists. Gay studies and queer studies, nothing good has ever come from it. Nothing good.
To push back, is it obvious that activism is a sign of a flaw in a discipline? So isn't it...
It's a sign of the death of the discipline. It's a sign that discipline's over.
But isn't it a good goal to have for discipline to enact change, positive change on the world? Or no. That's for politicians to do with the findings of science?
I mean,
not
why create an ideology and then set out to find disciplines that are weakly put together to try to back up your political ideology?
So ideology should not be part of science or of humanities.
Why would you? I mean, anyone could do it. You could decide to go in and be wildly right-wing about something and only do things that proved your right-wing ideas. Be fantastically anti-academic, fantastically anti-science, fantastic. It's an absurd way to mix up activism and academia, and it's absolutely rife. And critical race theory is one of the ones that completely polluted the academy.
Yeah, and there's been dark moments throughout history, both during World War II with both communism and Nazism, fascism that infiltrated science and thereby corrupted it.
Yes. I mean, for instance, also, let's face it, in science, as in everything else, there are dark, difficult things. It's much better we know about them, face up to them, and try to find a way socially to deal with them than that you leave them in the hands of some activist who wants to do stuff with them.
Some of my best friends are activists. I'm just kidding. Okay.
Yeah. And none of my best friends are activists. That's how it should be.
Well, I was kidding because I don't have any friends. But okay. We didn't get to some of the ideas of critical race theory. What exactly is it? I'm actually in part asking this question quite genuinely.
Yeah. It's an attempt to look at everything, among other things, through the lens of race, and to add race into things where it may not be, as a way of adding. I'm trying to give the most generous estimation. To add race in as a conversation in a place where it may not have been in the conversation.
And that means history too? The history of racism?
Yeah. All history. And to look at it through these particular lenses. I mean, there's a certain, like all these things, there's a certain logic in it. Like with feminist studies or something, I mean, is there a utility in looking back through undoubtedly male-dominated histories and asking where the more silent female voice was? Yes. Very interesting. Not endlessly interesting, and can't be put exactly on the same par as, but it has a utility.
It's that endlessly, sorry to interrupt, that endlessly part that seems to get us into trouble a lot.
Absolutely. Here. Well, because of this thing of where do you stop? And that's always I talked about this in my last book, In the Manners of Crowds. It's one of the big conundrums in activist movements, and particularly in activist academia. Where would you stop? It's not clear because you've got a job in it. You've got a pension in it. You've got your only esteem in society is in keeping this gig going. I mean, is there any likelihood? Have you ever? It's the old academic joke, isn't it? That the end of every conference, the only thing everyone agrees on is that we must have another conference like this one. So one thing they always agree on: this conference is so great, we must have another one.
Well, that's a criticism you could apply to a lot of disciplines.
Of course,
civil engineering, bridge building. It's at a certain point. Do we need any more bridges? Can we just fly everywhere?
Well,
so
at the very least, you need to keep the bridges up.
Sure, and they would. Critical race theory folks would probably make the same argument. That at the very least, we need to keep the racism out. We have to make sure we don't descend into the racism.
It assumes all the time that we are living on the cusp of the return of the KKK,
right?
Which is totally wrong. I mean, it's a massive.
You say that now until the KKK armies march in. We can't always predict the future.
We can't always predict the future, and you can always say you should be careful, but you've also got to be careful of people who've got their timing like totally wrong, or their estimation of the society they're in.
You mean like most of society before in the 1930s when Hitler was? I mean, so many people got Hitler wrong.
Sure, they did,
and so
most people.
Maybe it was nice to have the alarmists thinking there.
Well,
beware of the man with the mustache.
If only it was that easy.
It's not always about facial hair.
I mean, I always say that. I mean,
it very often is.
These two clean-shaven chaps both say one of the problems of everybody knowing a little bit about Nazism is that they think that they know where evil comes from, and that it comes from like a German with a small mustache getting people to goose step, for instance. And that's not correct. A much better understanding of it is it can come from all number of directions and keep your antennae as good as you can. But once you end up in this society, which I would argue certainly parts of America in, where you're always in 1938, that's not healthy for a society either. Where people are so primed and think they're so well trained because they spent a term in school learning about the Second World War and the Holocaust, think they're so well trained in Hitler spotting that they can do it all the time. Look at all these phrases we now have in our societies, like dog whistle. You know, as I always say, if you hear the whistle, you're the dog. But people say, that's a dog whistle, as if they're highly trained anti-Nazis. I mean, you know, there should be some humility in it. We should be careful. We should be wary, for sure. And we should also be slightly humble in our inability to spot everything.